Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Eric Coleman with IIST, and I will be the moderator for today's webinar, Managing the Test Process, a Proactive Approach by Robin Goldsmith. We're excited you're able to join us today and set aside an hour to attend this webinar. This webinar is one of a series of free webinars to introduce the topics as well as the presenters of the upcoming SQTM conference in San Diego, California, September 13th through the 18th at the Sheraton San Diego Hotel and Marina. The conference focuses on advancing the test management and quality management professions by providing practical methods based on best practices. The ongoing theme of the conference, Practical, Proven, Feasible, keeps the focus on what works. To view the conference program and more information, visit www.qualitymanagementconference.com. Be sure to join us for the next webinar in the series, Part 2 of Defect Prevention, the Role of Testers in Improving Process and Reducing Costs of Quality by Dr. Meg Dehanna on June 12th from 11 a.m. to 12 p.m. Central Standard Time. To learn more about this and other webinars in the series, go to www.qualitymanagementconference.com. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available for viewing within 48 hours at www.qualitymanagementconference.com. I will now turn the webinar over to today's presenter, Robin Goldsmith. Robin?
Thank you, Eric. Welcome, everybody. And just a quick couple of notes about who I am. I do work directly with and train professionals in all areas related to quality and testing, requirements, software acquisition. I see these all as part of the same thing, enabling people and organizations to get what they want and need. And once upon a time, I did real work. I've been a developer and a systems programmer, and for many years been a consultant, starting with Big Four consulting firms. And have a bunch of degrees, things that might be a little bit more relevant to some of what we're discussing in these webinars is that I've been a member of two IEEE standard working groups that came up with revisions to IEEE standard 829 for software test documentation and IEEE standard 730 for software quality assurance. And I'm pleased to say that especially the 730 revision, which was a major revision, and we talked about it in the previous webinar about quality management, that revision incorporated a lot of the thinking from my proactive software quality assurance methodology. I'm also a subject expert for the Babok version 2 and for TechTarget.com software quality, searchsoftwarequality.com. Okay. And I'm the author of a book called Discovering Real Business Requirements for Software Project Success. So, as Eric mentioned, what we're doing here is giving you a preview of full-day seminars that occur at the SQTM conference in San Diego. And so today's webinar is a preview of an identically named Managing the Test Process, a Proactive Approach, all-day webinar that will be on Tuesday, September 15th. And you can find out more about it at the qualitymanagementconference.com website. And hopefully you'll find that the information today is helpful, but that you'd like to learn more, and you can indeed learn more about it at the SQTM conference. So here's what I hope that we can accomplish in the next few minutes. First of all, I want you to be able to identify what a process is and what your current testing process is. And we want to make a contrast between managing testing and managing the testing process. Now, I feel that this is an important contrast because in my experience, most people are busy managing the testing activities, but not the testing process. And consequently, you're missing out on opportunities to get considerable benefits. Okay? And want you to see how a more proactive testing process can be more effective, but that you also have to be aware that it's going to take more effort, more active management. But I think you'll find, and hopefully you'll agree, that the effort is worth the extra effort is worth the extra benefits. That when you manage your testing process, your testing can become more effective and more efficient. So now I'm going to ask you, if you would, to answer in the question box, what is a process and why do we care? So if you would, please type your answer into the question box. This will, I think, make the session more interesting for you and for other people. And so what is a process? I'm sure you all use that term. And why do we care? Great. So I'm seeing a definition here. Steps that we take to accomplish a task. And interestingly, that's very similar to what I already had typed into the slides. A set of steps or actions that should be taken to achieve a desired result. And, very similar to what you just said. Thank you very much for your contributions. And I apologize that I'm a little slow, but my questions window is not very big. So that looks like Yader or Yadira. Thank you. Okay. Now, excuse me. There's a pretty good chance that each of you would give a similar definition. And that's the good news, that's the bad news. The good news is that everybody, or most people, tend to have similar experiences, similar understandings. The bad news is that this definition is not accurate. That the common definition of what a process is loses sight of important aspects of processes. And it's one of the reasons that we have difficulty managing processes, including managing our testing process. Okay? So I think we can see this better if we start with an example. And so I'm going to ask you, if you would, to type into the question box, what are the steps and actions in your testing process? Now, I realize that some of you may have a very formally or explicitly defined testing process, and others of you maybe not. But what I'd like you to realize is that even if it's not explicitly defined, that you probably do have some kind of a defined process, a set of steps or actions that you tend to use, you tend to do over and over again when you carry out testing. So if you would, please type into your question box what you say your testing process is. Okay. So I'm going to type into my PowerPoint slide here, and I will apologize in advance because my computer tends to mess things up here, and it's going to take me a little bit of going to catch up with you because you're faster than I am. So deploy the build to QA environment. smoke testing. So let me deploy, build, oops. Okay. Smoke testing. Let's see if I can catch up here. Thank you for your answers. You're faster than I am. Functional testing, regression testing, integration testing, and UAT. So we've got functional testing, integration testing, UAT. There was something I just missed. Let's see what else. Regression testing. Okay. Okay, let's see if there are any others. Set up test data. In between, there will be defect raised and defect fixed. Okay. So let me guess that somewhere in here is the setup test data. Let's say that that's probably here. And then throughout all of these things, we're going to get defects raised and fixed. Okay, good. Ensure you have requirements to test to and the test environment. So let me guess that the ensure you have requirements to test to test environment. There's my computer making mistakes again. Okay. Let's see, we've got defect verification. So I would guess that, so we've got defects raised, verified, and fixed. Good. Any others? Doing okay. All of the above, deployment testing. Okay. And okay. Okay, super. So we've got a goodly number there. Now, for those of you who contributed, thank you very much. For those of you who did not contribute, I'm going to guess that at least in part it's because these things look similar to what you would have said. So we've got this set of steps or actions that are followed when carrying out testing, and so if we know what our testing process is, if our testing process consists of these steps or actions, then we're in a better position to manage that testing process. So I'm not going to bother typing this stuff, but if you could, please type what test process management means in your organization. And if you can, how is it done? Who does it? And how does it differ from managing the conduct of the testing, if it does? Okay. So I know that that's a lot of questions there, but anybody have any thoughts? Okay. Yeah. What does test process management mean in your organization? And I wouldn't be surprised if, for some of you, the answer is that's not a concept or a term that we really use actively. Okay. So if it is a term or a concept that you use, who does it, how is it done, and how does that differ from managing and conducting the testing, if it does? So any thoughts, anybody? Looking forward to your contributions again. So I know you didn't realize that you were going to have to do all the work today, but that's the price of admission. Right? So the test lead does the test management process. Okay. And the test process management isn't really done in my organization. We don't have formalized test process management. It's pretty much up to the testers to manage the test process and get the testing done. Okay, well now those are fairly typical responses. Okay. And so if it's up to the tester, what you're really saying is that the testing process probably is not getting managed, that you're managing the activity of testing, the conduct of testing, but that you're not really consciously managing the testing process. Now, ordinarily, somebody said, let's see, our supervisor is assigned a task and he assigns out to us. Test process management is done by test management tools. He receives an updated email once we completed the task in each environment. Okay, so I think what you're describing is managing the testing activity, the conduct of the testing, rather than managing the testing process. Now, you need to do both. And when you don't do both, then you're missing out on opportunities. So, can you identify, with regard to your current management of the testing process, any strengths of what you are doing, any weaknesses or issues of what you're doing? Realize that if you're not managing the testing process, then you probably don't have strengths, although some of you may feel there are strengths in however it's being done, even if it's not being done very consciously. So if you would, any additional thoughts? Okay. So type into the question box, anybody? Okay. Any strengths, any weaknesses, any issues? You know, I would guess for most of you that the main issue is that it's not, that your testing process is not really being managed. Okay, and let's see, we don't have any process, so we can't identify any strengths. That's the typical thing. And so the issues are that you're not being able to manage your testing process, which means that you're probably not in a position to get as much out of your testing as you might want to. You can't improve it nearly as effectively. These are all limitations. So when we said that a process is a set of steps or actions that should be taken to achieve a desired result, well, I said that that's not accurate. And when people use set of actions or steps to achieve a desired result as their definition of a process, there's a pretty good chance that their process is not going to be as effective as it could be, and their ability to manage it is even less. So a process is a set of steps or actions, but it's also beliefs and customs and management practices and skills and knowledge that together produce some result. So your process is what produces your results. And the results and the process that it produces, or the results that it produces, are often or are not necessarily intended or desirable. That is, you can easily have a process that produces unintended or undesirable results. It is a process nonetheless. And very often, the process that's producing your results is not recognized. Now, the reason that it's so important to know what a process is and then to know what your process is because if you repeat the process, you will get essentially the same results. In other words, if you know what your process is, that helps you or enables you to predict your results. If you want to get the same results, repeat that process. Now this gets complicated because there are two types of processes. There is the real process that's actually producing your results, and very often it's an unrecognized process. People are not aware of the real process. And then there is a presumed process that people think is producing their results. A presumed process is often defined. That means that multiple people would say basically the same thing about the process. They would describe it similarly. So for instance, if I were to ask you what you say if I hold the door open for you, you'd say, thank you. That is a defined process. We all know to say thank you if somebody holds the door open for us. But it's not a documented process. It's defined but not documented. There's no sign up next to the door that says, say thank you if somebody holds the door open for you. So a process can be defined without being documented. If it's documented, then it is also defined. So if we want to change our results, we need to change our process. But which process do you think people change? The real process that's actually producing the results that they may not even be aware of? Or the presumed process that they think is producing the results? Well, they change what they think is producing the results. Excuse me. If the presumed process is different from the real process, if the presumed process is not actually producing the results, then changing a presumed process which is not producing the current results is very unlikely to change the results in the desired manner. This happens all the time. People change something that turns out not to be the thing that's really affecting the results. So if we are going to meaningfully manage our process or processes, we need to change the real process. And before we can change the real process, we first have to recognize what it is. So within the process world, we tend to speak of what's called the as-is or current state process. That's the real process that is currently producing the results that we're getting. And we want to change that to what's called the should-be process or the future state. The should-be process is requirements. Requirements are what it is that will reasonably achieve the desired results. And once again, if we don't recognize accurately what the current as-is process is, then we've got very little chance of coming up with an accurate should-be process. That's why our requirements are wrong, and that's why our projects tend to go off base. Now, this gets complicated by what are called silos. Some of you may be familiar with silos in an agricultural setting. A silo is a tall cylindrical structure where grain or food is kept for animals. If you were inside of a silo, your view of the world would be very narrow, very much out of context. You wouldn't have any way to know what was going on outside of the silo or in the silo next to you. And organizations tend to act as if they are in silos. They tend to take very narrow, out-of-context views. And when you take a view, even of reality, that's out of context, it can become a presumed process that turns out to be different from the real process. So if we want to manage processes, we need to look from the beginning to the full end result of the process. So let's see how this works. I'm sure many of you are familiar with scheduling the coding and then scheduling the testing to be done by the stop sign or the deadline. And I'm sure many of you have projects that are scheduled to be done by the deadline. There's going to be some coding, there's going to be some testing, and then done. And I bet that many of you are familiar with projects where the coding takes longer than expected. If the amount of testing is somehow proportional to the amount of coding, and we end up with more coding than expected, then we're going to need more testing than was originally scheduled. But what doesn't change? The deadline, the stop sign. And so what happens? The testing gets cut short. It gets squeezed. And we deliver trouble. Now, have any of you ever seen this happen? Have you ever seen it happen more than once? Would it be a safe bet that for most of you this happens all the time? Well, if this is what happens all the time, thank you for your answer. If this is what happens all the time, then the bottom is the real process. the top is the presume process. But if you look how organizations try to manage and improve their processes, they're continually acting as if that mythical presume process is what's happening. And when they try and make changes to a presume process that isn't really occurring, it doesn't work. So I challenge you to go to anybody in your organization and ask them to describe your development and testing process, and have anybody say, well, we schedule the coding and testing to be done by the deadline, we blow the coding, we squeeze the testing, and we deliver trouble. Some of you are probably laughing, because nobody would say that that is your development and testing process. But if it in fact is your development and testing process, and people aren't aware of it and act as if that's not what's happening, then you shouldn't be surprised when the results you get are not the desired result. So anyone can deliver by a deadline if it doesn't matter what they deliver. And this time from the beginning of the project to that arbitrary deadline is a silo. So if your organization is like most, it acts as if the consequences of the behaviors, the trouble, are unrelated to what you did that created that trouble. Okay? And when people don't recognize that, when people don't measure from the beginning to the full end result when it works right, well, then they're losing sight of their real process. Excuse me. So organizations that are effective understand that they need to measure and they need to be aware of their process from the beginning to the full end result where it works right. And that the consequences of the behaviors are what are causing the results that you get, or the behaviors that you're doing are causing the results that you get. And that if you want to get different results, you need to change the process that's producing the results. You need to change the real process. Okay? And now that's troubling, because somewhere along the line, the real process means people are not necessarily doing what they ought to be doing. So what I want each of you to do is think about your real process. And I'm going to go back to what we filled out here a minute ago. And so if you would, please type into the question box anything that is different or additional or not done here that you said is done. Any things that are part of your real process that were not identified here when you first identified your defined testing process. So think about your real process. What's different? So please type your answers into the question box. Okay. Because I'm sure that there are things that are different. So what's different? Any suggestions, anybody? Okay, so we're getting something here. We used to have smoke tests and deployment testing after each deployment in the QA environment, but recently it changed. Management doesn't want that. Not sure if that's a good thing or a bad thing. So let's see. So you skip that, and what'd you say? Deployment testing. Yeah. Skip that. Any others? Anything else? Any other differences of your real process from the presumed process? Okay. We have post-production validation after the deployment is complete. Okay. So let me suggest that deployment and validation. Okay. Okay. Let's see, what else do we have here? Okay. Post-production validation. Not always enough time for us to test in the next environment and still supposed to approve as is. Oh, okay. So one of the things that was mentioned previously, but I think got lost in this, was change environments. You sometimes skip that. Let's see. We don't have requirements or comps to test against. Don't get to test at 100% because of time constraints. So let's see here. Don't have requirements. And just ship it. Okay. Time constraints. That's the common thing. Let's see. When developers take their time for coding, then a build is also deployed to UAT without having QA testing done by the testers. So somewhere in here, we've got testing by QA up. That's also skipped. And in the name of saving time, build deployed in partial modules whereby regression testing must be done. Requirements change several times. Okay. So we've got okay. And we have to redo the testing when there are changes and defects, right? Okay. So the defects often reveal requirements. QA test lead not consulted when building the timeline. Okay, and some testing is even added into our tool to follow e-commerce changes. Let's see, where can we? Somewhere or another here, we've got schedule set without us. Okay, and let's see, we have, not sure where the tool use, okay, and maybe partial, something like that. You're doing, coming up with a lot of stuff here, aren't you? Okay. No formal documentation. No documentation, and so forth. So, we've got a considerably different picture now when we include the things in red compared to what was just in black. So the things in black are sort of the presumed process, and then when we incorporate the things in red, we're taking into account reality. And guess what? The real process is, considerably different from the presumed process. And if we're only going to manage the presumed process and be unaware of the real process, then our efforts to improve and to manage what's going on are going to fall short, because we're managing something that doesn't really exist. Okay? So hopefully you found that understandable and helpful. And so let's talk a little bit more about processes. So your process, the way that you do things, determines how you carry out a project. And in fact, it determines how you carry out project after project after project. That's your real process. So your real process is, here's how we do things here. And what we saw was that how we do things here is often a lot different from how we think we do things. And that it's kind of understandable how our real process is routinely and reliably and predictably producing trouble. Okay. So the way that we measure a process is by capturing measures of relevant variables across projects. So if your process determines how you do projects, then accumulating across projects will give you a picture of and measurement of your real process. And we need to measure and be conscious of two different types of things. So we need to be conscious of results, and then we need to be conscious of the things that are producing those results. Not just steps or actions, but beliefs and customs and management practices and so forth. So we need to identify what our results are, and then we need to identify what it is that produced those results, our real process. Because if we're going to make improvements, we need to understand which parts of our process are producing good results and need to be continued or even strengthened, and which parts of our process are not producing desired results or producing undesired results and need to be improved, enhanced. So I would suggest that managing the testing process, first of all, means how to defining how to appropriately determine what must be demonstrated to be confident it works, how you demonstrate it, and how to capture, report, and address those results. So your testing process is the way that you determine what must be demonstrated to be confident that something works, how you demonstrate it, and how you capture and report and address the results. So that's what we mean by a testing process. And managing the testing process starts with defining what your real testing process is. Okay. Now, when I say defining what your real process is, what I really mean is defining what your real process ought to be and contrasting that with what it is so that you can make the desired defined process your real process. So generally you need to know what's actually happening, what we want to have happen, where we have the differences, and then address them and make your desired real process the real process. And then as projects get carried out following your testing process, you need to measure the results and the causes of those results. And results can be end results and they can be intermediate results. You need to identify variances from those desired results. You need to examine and adjust to improve strengths and overcome weaknesses. So then this is like shampooing, rinse and repeat, lather, rinse and repeat. Okay? You need to keep doing this. Managing the testing process is not a one-time activity. Okay? So you need to define an appropriate process. You need to make it the real process. You need to measure what's actually happening. You need to identify where you're not getting what you want. You need to re-examine and adjust accordingly. And you need to keep doing that because things change, people get tired, new things happen. You've got to stay on top of it. You may need to change your definition of your desired testing process. So when we define the desired process, okay, in our full day class, we get into identifying the key concepts, okay, and that's covered in Chapter 1 of the full day class. So key concepts that the testing process should address. Some of those are implicitly recognized, even taken for granted. Things that we want to make sure are explicit. So you mentioned, for instance, gee, we don't have time to do the testing that we need to do. Well, there's a reason for that. Probably because things are being taken for granted and are not conscious. We want to make them conscious. And we need to identify ways to overcome issues that we've got with our current process. We want to incorporate good ideas from a variety of sources. So methodologies, which we deal with in Chapter 1, maturity models, which we deal with in Chapter 2, tools we deal with in Chapter 3, and standards we deal with in Chapter 4. And then we want to add in other good practices as appropriate. So that's really the approach that we follow, but it all starts with understanding and measuring what our real process is. So a couple of key concepts. Testing is an act of confirmation and demonstration, not assumption. that the system does what it's supposed to do and doesn't do what it's not supposed to do. Okay. So defects are a failure to do what it's supposed to do or doing what it's not supposed to do. Our challenge is accurately and adequately identifying what it's supposed to do and what it's not supposed to do. Testing means comparing actual results to expected results. If you have not identified your expected results and you get actual results, you're probably going to presume that the actual results are correct. What that means is that testing without independently and preferably previously defining the expected results is probably not going to provide much value. And realize, a lot of people say, well, it's impossible to test everything and it's impossible to have clean code. Actually, it's not impossible to test everything. It's not impossible to have clean code. What's impossible is to know for sure that you've tested everything and have clean code. Because if you know for sure, that means you know what all the defects are. If you know what all the defects are, you don't need to test. But if you don't know what all the defects are, then you cannot assume that there are no defects just because you haven't found any. Now, some of you may be familiar with exploratory testing. Exploratory testing is often done without defining expected results. Runs a test, it gets results, and then somebody's making some judgment calls, some presumptions about whether or not those results are right. Or exploratory testing is simply experimenting to find out how a system or program actually works rather than demonstrating that it does what it's supposed to do and doesn't do what it's not supposed to do. So I'm not saying exploratory testing is a bad technique, only that it's not sufficient by itself and that those people who use exploratory testing as their primary method of testing are probably missing a lot of important stuff. So one of the things we know is that developers make a lot of defects, a lot of errors. Typically anywhere from 15 to 70 errors per 1,000 lines of code, and that's called a defect density. KLOC, KLOC, K for 1,000, LOC, lines of code, is a typical defect density measure. You may measure number of defects per function point, per module. Okay. But defect density is a way to normalize. The thing is that developers think they only make one or two mistakes. They grossly underestimate the number of errors that they've made. And the fact is that developers tend to think that they found all of their errors, when in fact they typically find anywhere from 25 to 75% of their errors, more often or very often on the lower end. Now, as testers, you're very familiar with this. So the developer gives you code, says the code is clean, and then you find all kinds of defects in it. Surprise, surprise, surprise. Well, what we forget is that when it gets through to the user, out to the field, that it's very common that there are still anywhere from 3 to 8 errors per 1,000 lines of code. Somewhere between 5 and 15% of the errors in typical organizations reach the users, reach the field. Capers-Jones, who is a prominent software measurement guru, says that just statistically, the organizations that are the cream of the crop are the ones that deliver 5% or fewer of their errors to the users. That means 95% quality. So in the software world, 95% quality is considered good. In the rest of the world, 99% plus quality is considered necessary. So we have this disconnect between what the software world tends to think is adequate and what the rest of the world tends to think is adequate. And because most of our organizations are dependent upon their software to deliver that 99+% quality, if the software is only in 95%, the organization is not going to be able to deliver. That's a big problem. Now, world-class organizations are on record as reporting orders of magnitude lower defect densities, as low as 0.2 or even 4/100 of an error per 1,000 lines of code. I'm telling you this for two reasons. First of all, to let you know that it can happen, and secondly, to let you know that the organizations that are delivering these world-class levels of defect density are not acting the same way as the typical organization. Okay? And the first thing that the world-class organizations do differently is they measure. The reason that we know the defect densities from the world-class organizations is because they measure. Most of us come from organizations that don't measure. You keep track of defects for purposes of fixing them, but you don't use that information to evaluate or manage or guide your process. So think about a spec. A spec is the instruction to the developer. And so here's a very simple spec. The operator is going to enter a customer number in this field over there. The computer is going to look up the customer in the database and display the customer name in a field over here. And could that be coded wrong? Of course, it happens all the time. The fact is that the best developers and the best analysts and the best specs still are imperfect. Developers and analysts make mistakes all the time. So what would happen if we added some information? Let's say, for instance, that customer number C123 is John Paul Jones, and that should be displayed as Jones, John P. period. Now, would having that additional information help the developer code that program correctly rather than coding it wrong and having then to find and fix that defect? Probably so. When we look at how developers spend their time, typically up to around 40% of a developer's time is spent redoing what they've already done, in many instances because they did not accurately understand their specs, their directions. So if having this additional information, and by the way, let me emphasize what this is. C123, that's an input. Jones, John P. period is an expected result. That's a test, input and expected result. If having that test information would help the developer cut that rework, and indeed it would that be a WIFM, a what's in it for me, for the developer? I think you'd find that it would be. That in fact, having test information before coding helps the developer code correctly rather than code wrong. Helps the developer save a lot of their time. You see, Your testing process, the purpose of your testing process should not be catching defects. It should be enabling the organization to deliver clean software. And if you can become part of enabling the developer to do it better in the first place, you're going to get far better results. And in fact, I would suggest that that is a proactive use of testing, and that that's probably considerably different from the way that you've been doing things now. Let me tell you, when developers are given test information that helps them develop correctly, they tend to ask for more. Okay? Now, when's the last time that a developer asked for more tests? Okay? Because the way that most tests are done, they are after the fact and they get in the way of progress. But when the tests are done in a way that help the developer, then everybody benefits. So when we get proactive, we can have a strategy where we want to help the developers be able to code more correctly by using testing information to help improve requirements in design and ultimately code. We want to enable the developers to not only prevent making errors, but if they do make errors, to catch more of them themselves when they can fix them quicker and cheaper. So the quickest and cheapest error to fix is the one that's never created. The next quickest is one that the developer catches himself or herself. We want professional testers who have specialized skills and knowledge. We want the professional testers to be able to take greater advantage of their skills and knowledge by being the double check, catching problems that the developers still missed, but not getting bogged down in all those trivial defects that typically developers make and miss. And we want user acceptance testing to be double checking the double checked software. We don't want the users to be the point in the process that we rely on for catching the bulk of the errors. And a lot of organizations do that. And it's A, they're not good at it, and B, it's too expensive and it occurs too late. So when we approach things this way, I think you'll find that we get a far better result. And I think you'll see that this is a proactive approach. So where does test process management fit in? It says let's define and have testing processes that support this type of a strategy. It doesn't happen by itself. Doesn't happen by continuing to do the same old, the same old way. You need to have a different perspective and understand that there are different approaches and different concepts and techniques. And we teach those in a variety of courses that I present. Managing the testing process is creating awareness of managing the process. Other courses that I present describe ways to carry this out. So hopefully you can now see what a process is. It's not just steps and actions that you take to achieve a desired result. It's the steps and actions and management processes, beliefs, and customs that produce a result, whether it's desired, whether it's intended, and whether the process is even recognized. And we've seen that your current real testing process may not be exactly the same as you presumed it to be. Managing the testing process is looking at and evaluating our results against what we do, changing what we do to be in line with achieving better results. We need to measure to manage. And I've suggested some concepts of proactive testing. There's much more to it than we can get into here. But how being proactive can make your testing process much more effective. But it doesn't happen by itself. You need to manage it. You need to understand it. You need to have the skills and knowledge and make things happen. So hopefully this has been understandable. If you have questions, please type them into the question window. I will remind you that the Software Quality and Test Management Conference in San Diego will be September 13th to 18th. I hope you will all join us there. I'd love to see you all in person. Remind you that this webinar that we just did is previewing my full day seminar that counts toward certifications. And if you want to contact me, you can contact me at robin_goldsmith@iist.org.
Thank you, Robin, for your time today, and thank you to everyone for joining us for today's free webinar sponsored by IIST, the leaders in education-based certifications and training. For more information on how IIST can help you or your organization, please visit www.iist.org. You can follow IIST on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and YouTube to find out more about IIST news, events, and promotions. Thank you all again for joining us today, and have a great day.